There are moments in life that break you, moments where you lose trust in the people closest to you. My stepfather abused me every night, and my mother, the one person I thought would protect me, didn't believe me. I felt alone, misunderstood, and trapped in my own home. But I decided to take control of my life. I found my voice, and I'm here today to tell you that no one should ever feel like they have to suffer in silence. My name is Isabel, and this is my story of survival, of reclaiming my voice, and of how I found strength even in the darkest times. This story isn't easy to tell, and it may not be easy to hear, but it's a story that needs to be shared. It's a story about finding courage when everything around you feels hopeless. It's about discovering that even when the people who should protect you fail to do so, you still have the power to protect yourself. When I was young, I believed that family was supposed to be a safe haven. I thought that home was where you could always find comfort, understanding, and unconditional love. I never imagined that the very place where I should have felt most secure would become the source of my deepest pain and fear. I never thought that the adults who were supposed to care for me would become the ones I needed protection from. Growing up, I was like any other child. I had dreams, hopes, and a natural trust in the world around me. I believed that adults had my best interests at heart, that they would guide me safely through life's challenges, and that they would always be there to catch me when I fell. This innocent faith in the goodness of others is something that many children possess, and it's something that should be protected and nurtured, not exploited and destroyed. But as I grew older, I began to realize that not all adults deserve the trust that children naturally give them. Some people use their position of power and authority to harm rather than help. Some people take advantage of a child's vulnerability and innocence for their own selfish purposes. This was a painful lesson that I had to learn far too early in life, and it changed everything about how I saw the world around me. The abuse I experienced didn't happen all at once. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, with small violations of boundaries that I didn't even recognize as wrong at first. This is often how abuse begins, not with dramatic, obvious acts of violence, but with subtle manipulations and gradual erosions of a child's sense of safety and normalcy. The perpetrator slowly conditions their victim to accept increasingly inappropriate behavior, making the child question their own instincts and judgment. What made my situation even more devastating was that when I finally found the courage to speak up about what was happening to me, the person I trusted most in the world, my own mother, didn't believe me. This betrayal cut deeper than the abuse itself in many ways. It taught me that even the people who claim to love you most can fail you when you need them most. It showed me that sometimes the very people who should be your greatest advocates can become your greatest sources of disappointment. The feeling of being disbelieved and dismissed by my mother was almost unbearable. It made me question everything I thought I knew about love, family, and trust. It made me wonder if maybe I was wrong about what was happening to me, if maybe I was overreacting or misunderstanding the situation. This self-doubt is one of the most insidious effects of abuse. It makes victims question their own reality and their own worth. For a long time, I remained silent about my experiences. I carried the weight of this terrible secret alone, feeling isolated and helpless. I thought that if I just tried harder to be a good daughter, if I just stayed quiet and didn't cause any trouble, maybe the abuse would stop. I thought that maybe if I could just endure it long enough, things would eventually get better on their own. But silence doesn't make abuse go away. Silence only protects the abuser and leaves the victim feeling more alone and powerless than ever. I learned this the hard way, through years of suffering that could have been avoided if I had been believed and supported when I first tried to speak up. Eventually, I reached a breaking point where I realized that I had to make a choice. I could continue to live as a victim, allowing others to define my worth and my future, or I could take control of my own life and become a survivor. I chose to become a survivor, and that choice changed everything for me. Taking control of my life wasn't easy. It required enormous courage to speak up again, to seek help from strangers when my own family had failed me, and to trust in my own strength when everything around me felt uncertain. But it was the most important decision I ever made, and it's a decision that I've never regretted. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a survivor who has found peace, healing, and purpose. I've learned that our past doesn't have to define our future, that we have the power to write our own stories, and that even the most painful experiences can become sources of strength and wisdom if we choose to learn from them rather than be destroyed by them. This is my story, and I'm sharing it with you because I want every person who has ever felt alone, unheard, or powerless to know that they are not alone, that their voice matters, and that they have the strength within them to overcome even the darkest circumstances. Growing up, I thought family meant safety. I believed that the word family was synonymous with protection, love, and unconditional support. In my young mind, family was the one constant in life that you could always count on, no matter what challenges or difficulties you might face in the outside world. My mother Margaret was kind, gentle, and caring in so many ways. She had a warm smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made everyone around her feel happy and loved. When Frank came into our lives, he seemed like an ordinary stepfather. He was polite, well-mannered, and appeared to genuinely care about both my mother and me. He brought flowers for my mother, helped with household chores, and even took an interest in my schoolwork and activities. To the outside world, and even to me at first, he seemed like exactly the kind of man my mother deserved after the difficulties she had faced as a single parent. I remember the early days when Frank first started dating my mother. He would come to our house for dinner, and we would sit around the kitchen table like a real family. He would ask me about my day at school, help me with my homework, and sometimes even play board games with us in the evening. These moments felt warm and normal, and I found myself hoping that maybe this man could be the father figure I had always wanted. My mother seemed happier than I had seen her in years. She would hum while she cooked dinner, take extra care with her appearance, and smile more often than she had in a long time. As a child, seeing my mother happy was one of the most important things in my world, and I was grateful to Frank for bringing that joy back into her life. I wanted so desperately for our little family to work, for us to be happy together, that I was willing to overlook the small things that didn't feel quite right. But as Frank became more established in our household, as he moved from being a visitor to being a permanent resident, things began to change in subtle ways. The changes were so gradual at first that I barely noticed them. It started with little comments that seemed innocent enough, but left me feeling uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite articulate. He would make remarks about how I was growing up, how I was becoming a young woman, and how I needed to be careful about the way I dressed and behaved. At first, I thought these comments were just Frank trying to be a protective stepfather. After all, isn't that what fathers are supposed to do? Aren't they supposed to look out for their daughters and help guide them through the challenges of growing up? I tried to convince myself that his attention was normal, that it was what I should expect from a father figure who cared about my well-being and wanted to help me navigate the complexities of adolescence. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me when he made these comments, that made me feel uneasy. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right about the way he spoke to me or the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought no one else was looking. I tried to push these feelings away, to convince myself that I was being silly or oversensitive, but the discomfort remained. The touches started small too. A hand on my shoulder that lingered just a moment too long. A hug that felt different from the casual embraces that family members normally share. A pat on the back that seemed to wander to places where it didn't belong. Each incident by itself seemed minor, almost insignificant, but together they created a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable and anxious. I began to notice that Frank's behavior toward me was different when my mother wasn't around. When it was just the two of us in the house, his demeanor would shift in ways that I found disturbing and confusing. The friendly, caring stepfather that he appeared to be in front of my mother would be replaced by someone who made me feel nervous and unsafe. He would stand too close to me, speak to me in ways that felt inappropriate, and look at me in ways that made my skin crawl. I started to dread the times when my mother would leave the house for work, errands, or social activities. What had once been normal, everyday occurrences became sources of anxiety and fear for me. I would find excuses to stay in my room, to visit friends, or to busy myself with activities that would keep me out of Frank's presence. But as a child living in the same house, it was impossible to avoid him completely. The confusion I felt during this time was overwhelming. I was old enough to sense that something was wrong, but I was too young to fully understand what was happening or to know how to respond to it. I had no frame of reference for this kind of situation, no previous experience to help me navigate these troubled waters. All I knew was that the man who was supposed to be protecting me was making me feel unsafe and uncomfortable in my own home. I tried to rationalize Frank's behavior, to find innocent explanations for the things that made me uncomfortable. Maybe he was just awkward around children. Maybe he didn't know how to interact appropriately with a stepdaughter. Maybe I was misinterpreting his intentions and making something sinister out of behaviors that were actually harmless. I desperately wanted to believe that there was a reasonable explanation for my discomfort, that I was wrong about my instincts and fears. But deep down, in a place that I was afraid to acknowledge, I knew that something was very wrong. My body was telling me what my mind didn't want to accept. The way my stomach would clench when I heard his footsteps approaching my room. The way my heart would race when I found myself alone with him. The way I would hold my breath and count the seconds until my mother returned home. These physical responses were my body's way of protecting me, of warning me about danger that my conscious mind wasn't ready to fully comprehend. The most painful part of this entire experience was feeling like I had nowhere to turn for help or support. Frank had successfully integrated himself into our family and our community. Everyone saw him as a good man who had stepped up to help a single mother raise her child. He was charming, helpful, and seemingly devoted to both my mother and me. Who would believe a young girl's vague complaints about feeling uncomfortable around such an apparently upstanding man? I felt trapped in a situation that I couldn't fully understand or articulate, surrounded by adults who saw only what Frank wanted them to see. The isolation was devastating, and it would only get worse as time went on, and Frank's behavior became more aggressive and deliberate. At first, it was small things. His hand on my shoulder that would rest there longer than felt appropriate, making me squirm with discomfort while he pretended not to notice my reaction. An inappropriate comment here and there about my appearance, my developing body, or the way I moved through the house. These moments would happen when my mother was busy in another room, when she was focused on cooking dinner or doing laundry, completely unaware of what was transpiring just a few feet away from her. Frank had a way of making these interactions seem almost accidental, almost innocent. He would position himself so that he could brush against me as I walked through the kitchen, or he would find reasons to be in the same small spaces as me when we were alone. When I would flinch or pull away, he would act surprised, as if he hadn't realized he was making me uncomfortable. He had perfected the art of plausible deniability, always maintaining just enough ambiguity that I began to question whether I was overreacting to normal interactions. The comments became more frequent and more pointed as time went on. He would tell me that I was becoming a beautiful young woman, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something predatory in his tone, something that made these supposed compliments feel like threats rather than praise. He would comment on what I was wearing, suggesting that certain clothes were too revealing or that I needed to be more careful about how I presented myself around the house. What made these interactions even more disturbing was the way Frank would immediately switch back to his normal, caring stepfather persona whenever my mother entered the room. It was like watching someone flip a switch, transforming from someone who made me deeply uncomfortable to someone who appeared to be nothing but kind and supportive. This dramatic shift in behavior made me doubt my own perceptions and memories of what had just happened. I began to feel like I was living in two different realities. In one reality, Frank was the loving stepfather that my mother saw, the man who helped with household chores, brought home flowers, and seemed genuinely invested in our family's happiness. In the other reality, he was someone who made me feel unsafe and violated in ways that I couldn't fully articulate or understand. The disconnect between these two versions of the same person was maddening and isolating. As Frank became more confident in his ability to manipulate situations without being detected, his behavior escalated. The inappropriate touches became more deliberate and more invasive. He would find excuses to enter my room when I was changing clothes or getting ready for bed. He would offer to help me with tasks that I was perfectly capable of handling myself, using these offers as opportunities to get closer to me than was appropriate. The worst part was that he seemed to enjoy my discomfort. There was a look in his eyes when he saw me flinch or try to move away from him, a satisfaction that told me he was fully aware of what he was doing and that he derived some kind of twisted pleasure from my fear and confusion. This realization was devastating because it meant that his behavior wasn't accidental or misguided. It was deliberate and calculated. Soon, Frank began locking doors to ensure privacy for his inappropriate behavior. He would wait until my mother left the house for work or errands, and then he would make sure that we wouldn't be interrupted. The sound of a door lock clicking became one of the most terrifying sounds in my world because I knew it meant that I was trapped with him and that whatever was about to happen would be worse than what had come before. He would lock the door to the living room when we were watching television together, claiming that he didn't want my mother to interrupt our bonding time. He would lock the door to the kitchen when I was helping with dinner preparation, saying that he wanted to teach me cooking skills without distractions. Each locked door represented another barrier between me and safety, another way that Frank was asserting his control over me and my environment. The isolation was suffocating. Frank made sure that these incidents happened when no one else could witness them, when there would be no corroborating evidence of his behavior. He was careful to never leave physical marks or evidence that could be easily detected. Instead, he relied on psychological manipulation and the violation of boundaries to assert his power over me. This type of abuse is insidious because it leaves no obvious traces, making it easy for others to dismiss or doubt. I didn't know how to react to what was happening to me. I had no frame of reference for this kind of situation, no guidance on how to respond to an adult who was violating my trust and my boundaries. I was too young to fully understand the nature of what was happening, but I was old enough to know that it felt wrong and that it was making me deeply unhappy and afraid. I didn't know who to tell about what was happening. Frank had positioned himself as a pillar of our community and our family. He was well liked by my mother's friends, respected by our neighbors, and seen as a positive influence in our lives. The idea of accusing such an apparently upstanding man of inappropriate behavior seemed impossible and terrifying. Who would believe a child's word against an adult who seemed so trustworthy and reliable? I thought no one would believe me, especially my mother. Frank had been so careful to cultivate his image as a loving and devoted stepfather that any accusations I might make would seem outrageous and unbelievable. He had invested considerable time and energy into building relationships with the adults in our lives, ensuring that they would see him as credible and trustworthy, while viewing me as just a confused or attention-seeking child. The manipulation extended beyond just the inappropriate physical contact. Frank began to isolate me emotionally from my mother, creating situations where he could position himself as the more understanding and supportive parent figure. He would take my side in minor disagreements with my mother, offer me privileges or treats that she might not approve of, and generally work to create a sense that he understood me better than she did. This emotional manipulation was perhaps even more damaging than the physical violations because it made me question my relationship with my mother and my own judgment about who I could trust. Frank was systematically undermining my support system, making me more dependent on him while simultaneously making me less likely to seek help from the people who should have been protecting me. When I finally did try to tell my mother what was happening, Frank had already laid the groundwork for my accusations to be dismissed. He had spent months portraying me as a difficult, dramatic child who tended to exaggerate or misinterpret situations. He had planted seeds of doubt about my reliability and my tendency to seek attention through storytelling or embellishment. My mother's reaction was devastating. She thought I was exaggerating, that I was being overly sensitive or misunderstanding Frank's intentions. She seemed to believe that I was making up stories or blowing normal interactions out of proportion. Frank told her that I was going through a difficult phase, that I was having trouble adjusting to having a stepfather, and that I was acting out as a way of testing boundaries and seeking attention. For reasons I couldn't understand at the time, my mother sided with Frank. Perhaps she wanted so desperately for our family situation to work that she couldn't allow herself to believe that the man she loved was capable of hurting her child. Perhaps Frank's manipulation had been so effective that she genuinely couldn't see past the facade he had created. Whatever the reason, her decision to dismiss my concerns left me feeling more alone and hopeless than ever before. I felt invisible, like my pain didn't matter, like my voice didn't count. The two adults who were supposed to protect me had failed me in the most fundamental way possible. One was actively harming me, and the other was refusing to acknowledge that harm was occurring. I was trapped in a nightmare with no apparent way out. I felt trapped. The word trapped doesn't even begin to capture the suffocating sense of helplessness that consumed my daily existence. It was like being buried alive, surrounded by people who could see me and hear me, yet somehow completely unable to communicate the reality of what I was experiencing. I wanted desperately to tell someone about what Frank was doing to me, but I didn't know who would believe me after my own mother had dismissed my concerns so completely. The rejection from my mother had shattered something fundamental inside me. When the person who is supposed to love you most in the world, who is supposed to protect you above all else, tells you that your pain isn't real or that you're exaggerating your experiences, it does something devastating to your sense of self-worth and your ability to trust your own perceptions. I began to question everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, about what was normal and what was harmful. My family, the people I should have been able to turn to for help and support, didn't understand the depths of what was happening to me. They saw only what Frank wanted them to see, a caring stepfather who was trying his best to build a relationship with a difficult and ungrateful stepdaughter. They saw my withdrawal and my obvious discomfort around Frank as evidence of my inability to adjust to our new family situation, not as signs that something terrible was happening behind closed doors. I stayed silent, hoping against hope that the abuse would somehow magically stop on its own. I thought that maybe if I just endured it long enough, Frank would eventually lose interest in tormenting me and move on to other pursuits. I convinced myself that if I could just be perfect enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe he would leave me alone. This kind of magical thinking is common among abuse victims, especially children who have limited power and few options for escape. I hoped desperately that I could somehow make the situation go away through my own actions and behaviors. I tried changing the way I dressed, wearing baggy clothes that would hide my developing body and make me less noticeable. I tried avoiding areas of the house where Frank might find me alone. I tried timing my activities so that I would always be around other people when he was home, but no matter what strategies I employed, Frank always found ways to corner me and continue his pattern of abuse. The hypervigilance that became necessary for my survival was exhausting. I was constantly on alert, always listening for Frank's footsteps, always calculating escape routes, always trying to predict when and where the next incident might occur. This level of constant anxiety and fear is not sustainable for anyone, especially not for a child who should have been focused on normal developmental tasks like school, friendships, and exploring her interests and talents. I stayed quiet because I thought it was my fault. This is one of the most insidious aspects of abuse, the way it convinces victims that they somehow brought the mistreatment upon themselves. Frank had been very effective in making me feel responsible for his behavior toward me. He would tell me that I was too mature for my age, that I was sending mixed signals, that I was asking for his attention through my actions or appearance. These messages became internalized, making me believe that I was somehow complicit in my own victimization. I thought that if I just did everything right, if I could just figure out the correct way to behave, things would get better. I became obsessed with being the perfect daughter, the perfect student, the perfect child in every way. I thought that if I could just be good enough, Frank would have no reason to continue hurting me. I threw myself into my schoolwork, my chores, and any activity that might prove my worth and earn me the protection I so desperately needed. But they didn't get better. No matter how hard I tried to be perfect, no matter how much I achieved or how well I behaved, Frank's abuse continued to escalate. This taught me a devastating lesson about the nature of abuse, that it has nothing to do with the victim's behavior and everything to do with the abuser's need for power and control. The abuse wasn't happening because of anything I had done or failed to do. It was happening because Frank chose to abuse his position of authority and trust. Every day felt like a battle that I was fighting alone. I would wake up each morning with a sense of dread, knowing that I would have to navigate another day of trying to avoid Frank while pretending that everything was normal. I had to put on a mask of normalcy for the outside world, acting like a typical teenager while carrying the weight of this terrible secret. The emotional labor of maintaining this facade was overwhelming and isolating. I couldn't trust my own family, and I couldn't escape the situation. Trust is one of the fundamental building blocks of healthy relationships, and when that trust is violated by the very people who are supposed to protect you, it creates a profound sense of disconnection from the world around you. I felt like I was living behind a wall of glass, able to see other people living their normal lives, but unable to reach out and connect with them in any meaningful way. I couldn't escape the situation because I was financially dependent on my mother and Frank, because I had nowhere else to go, and because the adult world seemed determined to maintain the fiction that everything in our household was fine. Running away wasn't a realistic option for a young teenager with no resources or support system. I was trapped by my age, my circumstances, and the failure of the adults around me to recognize and respond to the signs of abuse. Walking through the house became an exercise in strategic planning and careful navigation. I had to constantly be aware of where Frank was, what he was doing, and whether my mother was home to serve as an unwitting buffer between us. I would tense up every time I heard his voice or his footsteps, my body automatically preparing for the next incident or violation. The place that should have been my sanctuary had become a minefield that I had to carefully traverse every single day. My body was in a constant state of anxiety and hyperarousal. I had trouble sleeping because I was always listening for sounds that might indicate Frank was approaching my room. I had trouble eating because my stomach was frequently churned with anxiety and fear. I had trouble concentrating at school because part of my mind was always focused on what might be happening at home or what I might have to deal with when I returned. The isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire experience. Humans are social creatures who need connection and support to thrive, especially during the vulnerable years of childhood and adolescence. When that support is withdrawn or corrupted, when the people who should be your allies become your enemies or your enablers, the psychological damage can be profound and long-lasting. I felt like I was carrying this enormous burden completely alone, with no one to share the weight or help me figure out how to handle it. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by the fact that I was surrounded by people who claimed to care about me, but who were either actively harming me or failing to protect me from harm. This kind of isolation creates a deep sense of disconnection from humanity and from hope itself. The silence became a prison that grew stronger with each passing day. Every time I failed to speak up about what was happening, it became harder to imagine that I ever could. Every time I witnessed Frank successfully manipulating situations and maintaining his facade of respectability, it became more difficult to believe that anyone would ever take my word over his. The silence that was initially imposed by fear and confusion eventually became a habit, a default response that felt safer than the risk of speaking up and being rejected again. But silence, I would later learn, doesn't protect victims. It only protects abusers. My silence was allowing Frank to continue his pattern of behavior with impunity, while slowly destroying my sense of self-worth and my ability to trust in the possibility of justice or protection. The longer I remained silent, the more isolated and hopeless I became, until it felt like there was no way out of the nightmare that my life had become. The breaking point came when I realized I couldn't live this way anymore. There's something profound that happens when a person reaches their absolute limit, when the pain becomes so unbearable that even the fear of the unknown seems preferable to continuing on the current path. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening that would forever change the trajectory of my life. It was a moment when everything crystallized, when all the confusion and self-doubt suddenly gave way to a clarity that I had never experienced before. I had been living in this nightmare for what felt like an eternity, but in reality had been several months of escalating abuse and psychological manipulation. Each day had brought new violations, new reasons to fear being alone in my own home, new evidence that the adults who were supposed to protect me had failed me completely. I had tried every strategy I could think of to make the situation better, to find some way to coexist with Frank that didn't involve constant fear and violation, but nothing had worked. That particular evening started like so many others. My mother had left the house to attend a book club meeting with her friends, something she did every Tuesday night without fail. These weekly absences had become a source of dread for me because they meant that I would be alone with Frank for several hours, with no buffer, no protection, and no witness to whatever he might decide to do. I had learned to time my activities around my mother's schedule, but there were some situations that simply couldn't be avoided. Frank had been watching me all day with that predatory look that I had come to recognize and fear. There was something different about his demeanor that evening, something more intense and focused than usual. He seemed to be waiting for something, planning something, and the anticipation was making my anxiety levels spike beyond what I could comfortably manage. I tried to stay busy, tried to find tasks that would keep me occupied and hopefully make me less of a target for his attention. As soon as my mother's car pulled out of the driveway, Frank's entire demeanor shifted in a way that was both familiar and terrifying. The mask of the caring stepfather that he wore for my mother's benefit disappeared completely, replaced by someone who made no effort to hide his inappropriate intentions. He approached me in the living room where I was trying to focus on my homework, hoping that the appearance of being busy with schoolwork might deter him from whatever he had planned. But Frank was beyond being deterred by my attempts at avoidance. He sat down next to me on the couch, far closer than was appropriate, and made a comment that was so explicitly inappropriate and threatening that it shattered any remaining illusions I might have had about the nature of his behavior toward me. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that Frank's actions weren't the result of misunderstanding or poor judgment. They were deliberate, calculated acts of predation. The comment he made that night crossed a line that even his previous behavior hadn't approached. It was explicit, threatening, and left no room for misinterpretation or rationalization. For the first time, Frank had dropped all pretense of his behavior being anything other than what it was: sexual abuse of a minor child who was under his care and protection. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the true nature of the person who had been living in our home and terrorizing me for months. Frank crossed the line in a way that made it impossible for me to continue pretending that maybe I was overreacting or misunderstanding his intentions. There was no ambiguity in his words or actions that night, no way to rationalize or minimize what was happening. He had made his intentions crystal clear, and those intentions were more disturbing and threatening than anything I had previously experienced at his hands. My mother was in the other room when this escalation occurred, but she might as well have been on another planet for all the protection she could offer me. Frank had timed his most egregious behavior for moments when she was distracted or absent, and he had become skilled at gauging exactly how much he could get away with without being detected. But that night, something about his behavior felt different, more desperate and more dangerous than before. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The situation had escalated beyond anything I could continue to endure, and Frank's behavior suggested that things were going to get much worse if I didn't take action to protect myself. The illusion that I could somehow wait out the abuse or find a way to make it stop through my own behavior had been shattered completely. I couldn't keep pretending that this was something I could handle on my own, that I could somehow make myself small enough or invisible enough to avoid Frank's attention. His behavior that night made it clear that my survival strategies were no longer adequate to protect me from what he was planning to do. The escalation was unmistakable, and I knew instinctively that if I didn't act soon, something even more terrible was going to happen. The fight-or-flight response that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally kicked into high gear. My body was flooded with adrenaline, my heart was pounding, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from Frank and away from that house as quickly as possible. For the first time since the abuse had begun, my survival instincts were stronger than my fear of the unknown consequences of speaking up or leaving. I had to leave. This realization came to me with such force and clarity that it felt like a revelation. All of the reasons I had been giving myself for staying, my financial dependence, my concern for my mother's feelings, my fear that no one would believe me, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the urgent need to protect myself from further harm. I understood that staying in that house meant accepting that the abuse would continue and likely escalate even further. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't stay another night in that house with Frank. The unknown risks of leaving seemed infinitely preferable to the known dangers of staying. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe there was a way out of the nightmare that my life had become. The prospect of leaving was terrifying, but it was also liberating in a way that I hadn't expected. I couldn't stay in that house another moment. Every fiber of my being was telling me that I was in immediate danger, that Frank's behavior had crossed into territory that made my continued presence there untenable. The breaking point wasn't just about that one incident. It was the culmination of months of abuse, manipulation, and the failure of the adult protection systems that should have kept me safe. I had to protect myself because no one else was going to do it for me. This was perhaps the most painful realization of all, that I was completely on my own in this situation, that the adults who were supposed to care for me had either become my abusers or had failed to recognize and respond to the abuse that was happening right under their noses. If I was going to survive this situation, I was going to have to be my own rescuer. The decision to leave wasn't made lightly or impulsively. It was the result of months of escalating abuse and the gradual realization that the situation was never going to improve on its own. Frank's behavior that night simply provided the final push that I needed to overcome my fear and take action to protect myself. It was the moment when my survival instinct finally overcame all of the other factors that had been keeping me trapped in that house. I had to find a way out, and I had to find it immediately. The urgency of the situation had become undeniable, and I knew that every moment I delayed was another moment of danger. The time for hoping and waiting and trying to make the best of a bad situation had passed. The time for action had arrived, and despite my fear and uncertainty about what would happen next, I knew that I had to take that step into the unknown in order to save myself. Leaving was the hardest thing I ever did. The decision to walk away from everything I had known, even though that familiar environment had become a source of pain and trauma, required a kind of courage that I didn't even know I possessed until that moment. It meant acknowledging that the family structure I had desperately wanted to believe in was fundamentally broken, that the adults who were supposed to protect me had failed me, and that I was going to have to navigate the world as a young person without the safety net that most children take for granted. The physical act of leaving was terrifying in ways that I hadn't anticipated. As I packed a small bag with the few possessions that seemed essential, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely manage to fold my clothes or gather my belongings. Every sound in the house made me freeze with fear that Frank would discover what I was doing and find a way to stop me. The weight of what I was about to do felt enormous, almost overwhelming, but the alternative of staying had become impossible to accept. I had no clear plan for where I would go or how I would survive once I left the house. At my age, my options were extremely limited. I had no job, no income, no legal right to make decisions about my own living situation, and no extensive network of adults who might be willing to help me. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was frightening, but it was still preferable to the certainty of continued abuse if I remained in that house with Frank. But leaving was also the best decision I made. Despite all of the fear and uncertainty that surrounded my departure, there was something profoundly liberating about finally taking action to protect myself. For months, I had felt completely powerless, at the mercy of Frank's whims and my mother's inability to see what was happening. By choosing to leave, I was reclaiming some measure of control over my own life and my own safety. It was the first time in a very long time that I felt like I had any agency in my own story. The immediate aftermath of leaving was chaotic and difficult. I had to navigate systems and institutions that were designed for adults, not for teenagers who were trying to escape abusive situations. I had to learn how to advocate for myself in ways that I had never needed to do before. I had to find adults who would take my situation seriously and who would be willing to help me rather than simply sending me back to the dangerous environment I had just escaped. I went to therapy, something that I had never imagined would be part of my life, but which became absolutely essential to my healing process. Finding a therapist who understood trauma and who believed my story was a crucial step in beginning to process what had happened to me. For the first time since the abuse began, I had an adult in my life who listened to me without judgment, who validated my experiences, and who helped me understand that none of what had happened was my fault. Therapy was not an easy process. It required me to revisit painful memories and experiences that I would have preferred to forget completely. It meant acknowledging the full extent of the damage that had been done to my sense of self-worth and my ability to trust others. It meant confronting the reality that my mother's failure to protect me had been just as traumatic in some ways as Frank's actual abuse. But it also gave me tools for understanding and processing my experiences in healthier ways. I found people who supported me, which was perhaps the most healing aspect of this entire journey. After months of feeling completely isolated and alone, I discovered that there were adults in the world who were willing to believe me, to help me, and to provide the protection and guidance that my own family had failed to offer. These relationships taught me that not all adults were like Frank or like my mother, that there were people who could be trusted and who would use their power to help rather than to harm. The support I received came from various sources: social workers, counselors, teachers, and other caring adults who recognized that I was a young person in crisis and who were willing to step up and provide assistance. Some of these relationships were professional, while others were more personal, but all of them contributed to my growing understanding that I was worthy of protection and care. This was a revolutionary concept for someone who had been conditioned to believe that abuse was something she deserved or had brought upon herself. Slowly, I began to heal. The healing process was not linear or predictable. There were setbacks and difficult days when the trauma felt as fresh and painful as it had when the abuse was actively occurring. There were times when I questioned my decision to leave, when the uncertainty and instability of my new situation felt overwhelming. But gradually, incrementally, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been damaged or lost during the months of abuse. I realized that I wasn't broken, even though I had felt shattered and irreparable for so long. The abuse had damaged me, certainly, but it hadn't destroyed the core of who I was or my capacity for growth and healing. This realization was profound and transformative because it meant that my future didn't have to be defined by what had been done to me in the past. I could choose to be a survivor rather than remaining forever a victim. I was surviving, and more than that, I was discovering that I was strong in ways that I had never recognized before. The very fact that I had endured months of abuse without completely falling apart was evidence of a resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. The courage it had taken to finally leave that situation, despite all of the unknowns and risks involved, proved that I had inner resources that could sustain me through even the most difficult circumstances. I chose to take control of my life in ways that went beyond just removing myself from the abusive situation. I chose to engage actively in my own healing process, to seek out the help and support that I needed, and to work on rebuilding my sense of self-worth and my ability to trust others. These were conscious decisions that required ongoing effort and commitment, but they were also empowering choices that reinforced my growing sense of agency and self-determination. I chose to speak up, not just about my own experiences, but about the broader issues of child abuse and the failures of adult protection systems. I began to understand that my story was not unique, that there were countless other children who were suffering in silence just as I had. By finding my voice and learning to use it effectively, I could potentially help other young people who were trapped in similar situations and who needed to know that escape and healing were possible. I chose to heal, which meant making a commitment to doing the difficult work of processing trauma and rebuilding my life. Healing isn't something that happens automatically with the passage of time. It requires active participation and a willingness to confront painful truths about what happened and how it affected you. I had to learn new ways of thinking about myself and my experiences, new strategies for managing difficult emotions, and new skills for building healthy relationships. I chose to protect myself, not just in the immediate sense of removing myself from danger, but in the ongoing sense of learning to recognize and respond to potential threats or unhealthy situations. I had to develop better boundaries, stronger instincts about who could be trusted, and more effective strategies for advocating for my own needs and safety. These skills would serve me well throughout my life, helping me to avoid other potentially harmful situations and relationships. From that moment on, I promised myself I would never let anyone silence me again. This promise became a cornerstone of my identity as a survivor and as a person who had reclaimed her power. It meant that I would speak up when something didn't feel right, that I would trust my instincts even when others tried to dismiss or minimize my concerns, and that I would use my voice to advocate not only for myself, but for others who might not yet have found theirs. The transformation from victim to survivor was not instantaneous or complete. It was an ongoing process that required constant recommitment and continuous work. But the foundation was laid in that moment when I chose to leave, when I chose to seek help, and when I chose to believe that I deserved better than what I had been accepting. Those choices changed everything about the trajectory of my life and opened up possibilities that I hadn't been able to imagine while I was trapped in that abusive situation. I found peace, After years of turmoil, trauma, and the difficult work of healing, I discovered that it was possible to move beyond the pain that had once defined so much of my existence. This peace didn't come easily or quickly. It was hard-won through countless hours of therapy, self-reflection, and the gradual rebuilding of my sense of self-worth and my ability to trust in the goodness of life and other people. The journey to peace was not a straight path. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the old feelings of fear and helplessness would resurface without warning. Trauma has a way of leaving echoes that can reverberate through your life long after the actual danger has passed. But I learned that healing doesn't require the complete absence of difficult memories or emotions. It requires developing the tools and resilience to navigate those challenges without being overwhelmed by them. I found strength in myself that I never knew existed. The abuse and its aftermath had initially made me feel weak, broken, and powerless. But as I worked through the healing process, I began to recognize that surviving what I had endured actually required tremendous inner strength. The fact that I had not only survived but had chosen to seek help and build a better life was evidence of a resilience that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered and cultivated. This strength manifested in many different ways as I grew older. I became more confident in my ability to handle difficult situations, more trusting of my own instincts and judgment, and more willing to take risks in pursuit of my goals and dreams. The experience of overcoming such significant trauma had taught me that I was capable of handling much more than I had ever imagined, and this knowledge became a source of empowerment in all areas of my life. I found strength in my children, who became my greatest teachers and my most powerful motivation for continued healing and growth. When I became a mother myself, I was determined to break the cycle of dysfunction and abuse that had characterized my own childhood. My children deserved better than what I had experienced, and they deserved a mother who was emotionally healthy, present, and capable of providing the safety and security that every child needs. Raising children as a survivor of childhood abuse presented unique challenges and opportunities. I had to work hard to overcome my own trauma responses and triggers so that they wouldn't negatively impact my parenting. I had to learn how to create the kind of safe, nurturing environment that I had never experienced myself. But my children also gave me a powerful reason to continue working on my own healing and to model the kind of strength and resilience that I hoped they would develop in their own lives. I found strength in the people who truly cared for me. One of the most healing aspects of my recovery was discovering that there were people in the world who were capable of loving me unconditionally, who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, and who were committed to supporting my well-being rather than exploiting my vulnerabilities. These relationships taught me what healthy love and support actually look like. Building these relationships required me to overcome significant trust issues and to learn how to be vulnerable with safe people. After experiencing such profound betrayal from the adults who were supposed to protect me, opening myself up to new relationships felt terrifying and risky. But I gradually learned to distinguish between people who were trustworthy and those who weren't, and I developed the skills necessary to build and maintain healthy connections with others. I raised my children to know that their voices mattered. This became one of my most important missions as a parent, ensuring that my children understood from a very early age that they had the right to speak up about anything that made them uncomfortable, that their feelings and perceptions were valid and important, and that they would always be believed and supported when they came to me with concerns or problems. I wanted my children to have the kind of childhood that I had never experienced, one characterized by safety, open communication, and unconditional love. I worked hard to create an environment where they felt free to express themselves honestly, where they knew that they could come to me with any problem without fear of judgment or dismissal, and where they understood that their well-being was my highest priority. Teaching my children about body autonomy, appropriate boundaries, and the importance of trusting their instincts became central to my parenting philosophy. I wanted them to have the knowledge and confidence that I had lacked as a child, so that they would be better equipped to protect themselves from potential harm and to seek help if they ever found themselves in dangerous situations. I raised my children to know that they were never alone. One of the most devastating aspects of my own childhood trauma had been the profound sense of isolation and the feeling that I had nowhere to turn for help. I was determined that my children would never experience that kind of abandonment or feel that they had to handle difficult situations entirely on their own. I made sure that my children knew they could always count on me to be there for them, no matter what challenges they might face. I also worked to surround them with a network of other trusted adults who could provide additional support and perspective when needed. I wanted them to understand that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness, and that there were always people who cared about their well-being and wanted to support them. I raised my children to know that they deserved to be safe and that it was never acceptable for anyone to hurt them or make them feel uncomfortable. I taught them that their safety and well-being were non-negotiable and that they had the right to set boundaries and to have those boundaries respected by others. These lessons were designed to give them the tools they would need to protect themselves throughout their lives. Today, I'm at peace with my past and excited about my future. The trauma that once defined my existence has been transformed into a source of wisdom, strength, and purpose. While I would never wish such experiences on anyone else, I have found ways to extract meaning and value from even the most painful chapters of my life. I understand now that our past doesn't have to determine our future, and that we all have the power to write new chapters in our stories. I learned that healing doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. Recovery from trauma is not a destination that you reach once and then maintain effortlessly. It's an ongoing process that requires continuous attention and commitment. But each day of that process brings new opportunities for growth, healing, and the discovery of inner resources that you may not have known you possessed. The healing process taught me that I was much stronger and more resilient than I had ever imagined. It showed me that even the most devastating experiences could be survived and overcome with the right support, tools, and determination. It revealed that I had the capacity not only to heal from my own trauma, but to use that experience to help others who were facing similar challenges. I am stronger than I ever knew possible. This realization has become the foundation of my identity as a survivor and as a person who has transformed pain into purpose. The strength that carried me through the darkest periods of my life continues to sustain me today, and it serves as a reminder that no matter what challenges I might face in the future, I have the inner resources necessary to overcome them. I'm here to say to anyone who's suffering, speak up, take control, and know that you are not alone. If my story accomplishes nothing else, I hope it serves as proof that survival is possible, that healing is achievable, and that there is life beyond trauma. No matter how hopeless your situation may seem, no matter how isolated you may feel, there are people who care about your well-being and who are willing to help you find your way to safety and healing. Your voice matters. Your pain is real and valid. Your safety and well-being are important, and you have more strength inside you than you may currently realize. The journey to healing may be difficult, but it is absolutely worth taking, and you don't have to take it alone. There is hope, there is help, and there is a future beyond the pain you may be experiencing right now.